Welcome to Roll to Save, the RPG History Podcast. Episode 1, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
Hello and welcome to Roll to Save, the RPG History Podcast, where we take a fond look at role-playing games from yesteryear. I'm your host, Iain. This is a rework of Episode 1 because we've had a couple of pieces of feedback. The first piece, well, it seemed that the initial podcast was far too long. Apologies for this. We're new to this podcasting game and we're passionate about a subject, and consequently, we had a lot to say about it. Secondly, there were a couple of sections that were far too quiet. Apparently, it sounded like I was reading a bedtime story. Given that I'm no Tom Hardy, that's probably quite a creepy prospect. Therefore, we've decided to split this podcast into 3 parts. The first will cover the history of the game, the second, its setting and system, and the third part will be a roundtable discussion. I've also messed around with the sound, so hopefully it sounds a bit better too. Oh, and I've ordered a new mic. After all, if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing right. In this episode, we take a look at Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, Games Workshop's first in-house RPG set in their self-styled, grim and perilous world of adventure. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay has a fond place in the heart of many gamers, especially British gamers, and was a novel take on the fantasy genre in a day and age where everything was very heroic and noble bright. For those of you unfamiliar with it, you'll quickly learn that while some games lent towards magic and great deeds of daring do, Warhammer was far grittier and everyman in its film. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Tell us where we're off to, voiceover lady.
This is the bit where they chat.
Welcome to the roundtable discussion for this, our inaugural episode of Roll to Save. I reckon you'd all probably be sick of my voice by now, so that's why I've brought on a couple of guests, Jason and Steve. How are you, gents?
Trying to avoid viruses, staying quarantined. Other than that, all good. Having just watched England lose at the rugby, though, I'm a bit upset.
Yeah, you kind of get gubbed, didn't you?
Yeah. Sad days.
What about you, Steve? How's things in Texas?
Cold. Very cold and warming up, hopefully. But good. Very good. Looking forward to doing this. It's been a little while since we had a chance to chat about the old days, Iain. So looking forward to getting into it with you.
Excellent. Well, the subject of this episode is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and the reason I chose that was because this was my first quote-unquote proper RPG, and by that I mean it was the first one that came with a massive book and needed proper character sheets and polyhedral dice. However, I did play another one prior to this. My gateway drug into the hobby, if you like, was fighting fantasy game books. And I was always on the lookout for new ones. And I can still remember going into, there was a bookshop in Paisley where I used to live for my sins called McDougall's. And I went in there with my mum to spend some pocket money. And I came across what I thought was a game book because it was under the Adventure Game Books logo, except it had a blue border at the top rather than a green one. And it was called Maelstrom. And it turned out to be a proper RPG. And rather than it being a fantasy setting, it was bizarrely set in 16th century Europe. And weirdly enough, myself and my friends seemed to absolutely love this game, which was weird because the opening adventure that you got, something as banal as you were a group of people travelling from St Albans to London in the 16th century. And for whatever reason, we absolutely loved this. So you can imagine that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay compared to a road trip from St Albans to London absolutely blew our tiny teenage minds. With that in mind, what was your guys' first experience with roleplay? What was the first game that got you into the hobby?
It was D&D for me. So I remember being like 11. So this is probably pre-decimalisation. It's pre the formation of the United Kingdom.
It was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago. But I remember I was always into the kind of wargaming side, and then I went to this club because I've always been a nerd. I went to this club and got introduced to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And I remember getting my leg chewed off within about 10 minutes of starting the game and dying. So it wasn't a very successful or auspicious start to my adventuring career, but yeah, it was good fun. Hooked me.
You were hooked.
I was hooked.
You were hooked. And you started
Yeah.
with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh yeah, I didn't take the easy route, man. None of this basic stuff.
No
Go
red box
straight
for you.
in. No red box for me, man. That took a while. In fact, I was really confused the first game I ever played with the red box D&D because somebody said, "Oh, what do you want to be as a character?" I was like, "No, I want to be an elven fighter magic user." And they went, "You can't be that. You can be an elf." I'm like, "Yeah, I want to be an elf, but I want to be a fire magic user." No, apparently it didn't work. So yeah, it confused the hell out of me.
And what about you, Steve?
Oh gosh, like I was saying a little bit ago, it's kind of it's funny you mentioned. I had a little chuckle there when you mentioned Final Fantasy because that brings back some memories. It was I think my gateway drug to role playing, even before I was a role player, was Choose Your Own Adventure, and then Final Fantasy, and then the Lone Wolf books a little bit later, and all those books by all those guys doing those great Choose Your Own Adventure style event stuff. And then it was Middle Earth role playing, which is a crazy complicated game. I still don't understand to this day if we ever actually, I don't remember if we actually played it much because we were too busy reading tables all the time. But then it was sort of like a move on to like D&D Red Box, and also Advanced Dungeons and Dragons followed kind of pretty swiftly after that. And I remember all my dog-eared copies of all those books and boxes. It was good times.
Yeah, I think the authors of the likes of the Lone Wolf books and the Fighting Fantasy series are probably owed commission by a great many role-playing companies, because these seem to have been certainly for people of my generation, the gateway drug that got people into role-playing as a whole. So what was your first experience with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay? You obviously both started with different systems, Jason with D&D and Steve with the insane decision to start with Middle-earth role-playing. Clearly somebody in your group had a great love for statistics. But what was your first experience with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay?
Just that big book. You know what I mean? It's quite a tome, isn't it? When you compare it to like the little red books that you get from D&D and stuff. I don't know. Just kind of got wheeled in, and it was like we'd all kind of had a look at the Warhammer like miniature combat game and stuff. So it had all that going for it, and it was kind of the first sort of attempt to kind of dark, low fantasy. It was a little bit more evil and a little bit more brooding than the kind of high fantasy that was D&D. And the whole thing about you building up your character through its careers, that was a bit weird. You know, you weren't starting with a finished article. You weren't starting with a wizard. You were starting, if you were lucky, with a wizard's apprentice, which I always wanted and never got. But it was a bit of a step change in terms of like look and feel.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about that. I covered that in the earlier sections when I was talking about the history of the game, and it really was the first game, to my mind, that had that gritty, to coin their term, grim and perilous feel to it. Because D&D and the likes, even things like RuneQuest, always were much more fantastic than Warhammer was. Warhammer was very in the mud. You know, you're trudging around in this horrible, grim city. Nobody's playing anything particularly heroic. And the general theme of it was there was always something evil in the background waiting to do some horror to you. And that was very different from D&D, which was, there's a dragon somewhere at the end of that dungeon, go and kill it and take its treasure. And the same as what you say about the book, I think everyone who was a Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay player remembers the size of the book. And it was one of the things, again, that I covered off earlier, that it was a whole complete package in one book. There wasn't separate books for the player and the GM, and there wasn't a separate scenario book. It was all bundled together, which I think was both intimidating and also beautiful thing to have this massive, weighty tome. And you could run the whole thing out of that one book. I remember when I first got it, it was a couple of years before I bought my first supplement for it, because there was so much in that book. They could just keep you going from the word go. Whereas the likes of Dungeons and Dragons, they were very into you buying their modules. Those little 32-page pamphlets that you could buy that would have a complete adventure in them. Whereas Warhammer had an awful lot there that could keep you going for a very long time. What about you, Steve? What was your first experience of it?
Oh gosh, a little bit, maybe not quite the same, but along the same road. Really, what it came down to, I remember very distinctly getting into the tabletop games, and when one of the first Games Workshop stores in the UK opened in Edinburgh, and probably the mid to late 80s, and just seeing that on the Edinburgh High Street in this prominent location just drew in me. It was just getting into role playing and pulled me into this world of Warhammer, and I got into both the fantasy tabletop and obviously the 40,000 as well after that. But that was really the clue to, okay, I already like role playing. Oh, they've got a game that is like a role playing game as well, and that I just dove straight to go get that book. And like you said, I mean, I still have fun memories of just like some of them was fun. Even wasn't playing the game in some ways. It was going through and reading all those different careers and all the crazy shenanigans that you could get up to. It was completely different. I mean, you go from the the red box of D&D, where you've got like 4 classes, to this hundreds of different careers that would just completely change the way the game played. And it was just, yeah, it was completely different. I still have very fond memories.
People loved the sheer fecundity of careers that there were available. And I always remember, I think, being quite a cruel games master, because I always ended up being the GM and never the player. But I used to insist that they rolled for career. I would never let anyone choose the career. And much like Jason said that, you know, he really wanted to get the Wizard's Apprentice career and never did. I had a player like that who desperately wanted to be a wizard, but never managed to roll that. And he always ended up like a shepherd or something mundane. But that was the thing with most of the careers. Most of them were really mundane. I mean, there were some cool ones like, you know, bounty hunter and witch hunter and stuff like that. But most of them, it was things like you were a peddler or a beggar or not very heroic. And I think it's why I know there was one guy in our group who was a real hardcore D&D player, and he never got on with it because, you know, he was a guy who always wanted to be the paladin when you played D&D, and, you know, wanted to be fitted out in armor and carrying magic swords and all that. And I think his first character in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was something like a grave robber, and he was like, "This isn't very heroic." I'm like, "No, it's not. You've got sick of being a grave robber, so you decided to go adventuring instead." And he never really got his head round it. But I think most people who really get into it really loved the career side of things, because it did give it a little bit of variety, and you could shoot for something a bit different rather than just being, "Oh, I want to be a 10th level fighter." It was, okay, well, actually, I want to, you know, become an explorer. And, you know, we could all be a exploring company and go and explore the old world. You both mentioned that you got involved with the tabletop side of it, and I was similar. I had Warhammer Fantasy Battle 2nd edition, which I kind of muddled my way through. It's really weird. You look at Warhammer Fantasy Battle 2nd edition, I've still got the book somewhere, and it looks like it was run off on someone's photocopier somewhere. It's really badly put together. And then you get this very plush Warhammer book produced just a few years later. And it was clear that, you know, GW were kind of up in their game at that point. But how did you find that the game compared to the tabletop war game?
It's quite easy to cross over, wasn't it? Because all the stat blocks were basically the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you had all the movement, the weapon skill, ballistic skill, all the bow skill. Sorry, I'm getting 40k on you. But you know that stat block has been the foundation for their model miniature gaming and for the role playing stuff. I guess the little tweaks and talents. Like what did they call them? The sort of
Skills.
Yeah, but they weren't really skills, were they? Because some of the
No.
skills were like very strong as a skill and things like that. The only reason I know that is because I was looking at the careers and I was like, oh yeah, I remember I was a boatman, and eventually my boatman became an outlaw, and my outlaw really desperately wanted to be a highwayman because they dress cool, you know, and all this. How it tracked on from the war game, which was the original question, is, you know, I thought it was very easy to transition from one to the other. It also gave you a sense of like how good you were. Because if you looked and all your elves are running around with weapon skill 4, and your guy had weapon skill, and they were percentile based, so they were multiplied by 10, and your weapon skill was 40 odd, you're like, actually, I'm pretty good, you know? at least as good as the pointy-eared guy in the corner.
Yeah, it's interesting because the early game, I always liked Empire because I always like to play the goody goodies. And let's face it, in this world, there was never really anyone good. There was always just less bad. Um, so I always liked the humans. I always liked, just the lore and stuff like that. And what I really loved about getting into the role play was because I was a lore nerd. I mean, and the early versions of those games that were still very early on in developing the lore. So, and even this game is kind of a product of that because you can tell. I reread some of the sections recently, and you can tell that it was so early on. They had the proto version of what is today the classic Warhammer Fantasy lore. Only parts of it are there, but you can definitely tell that it sort of tracks on from where they were at with. It was still a generic fantasy battle game with your elves and dwarfs, and even chaos was a thing, and orcs and so on from there, and they were trying to fill in the gaps. So it was interesting because you'd have your generic guys on horses and stuff like that. It wasn't back in then. The fantasy game was maybe slightly less fantastic than it is today, but you would still have guys on griffins and things like that. And this just lowered it down a little bit, and you're basically the guy with a spearman, maybe. You're really just the low level peons. You're not one of the generals or whatever. You're one of the guys in those massive units of 30 guys.
Yeah, that was one of the things I quite liked about it, because whenever I played the tabletop game, there was a rule that me and my friends used to have when we played it, and it was like you'd pick a guy in the unit who was you, and it just gave it a little bit of colour, because you would then spend the entire game desperately trying to make that one person survive. It had no outcome on anything, but because you picked that particular goblin to be you, or that spearman to be you, you were like, I don't want him to die. I want him to survive the battle, and great tales to tell. And that's kind of what the role-playing game felt like. I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. It was, you were that spearman, or the guy with the crossbow. You weren't the guy riding on the griffin chucking spells down from the sky. There was no way you were ever going to be him. So it was experiencing it from a feet on the ground perspective. And one of the things Jason mentioned earlier was the skills aspect to it. And I always remember a game once when we were rolling up characters, and it's, in this day and age, when you look at most role-playing games, they're very, very intent on balancing everything, because they don't want people to feel that they've somehow got unfairly treated because they've chosen, career X over career Y, or class X over class Y. It's all very balanced out. But if you look at the old first edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay rulebook, there's zero balancing in there. There's some stuff that is markedly better than others. And I remember a guy in our group rolled up one career. I think it was Road Warden. You got one skill as a Road Warden, which was ride horse. Whereas there was another guy who rolled up a pit fighter who got about 50 specialist weapon skills. And it was just this nod to the fact that, yeah, the world's really deeply unfair. You're some guy who's become an adventurer because all you can do is ride a horse, whereas this other fella can, arm wrestle Mecha Godzilla, but he's hanging around with you as well. Did you guys have any particular career or race in the game that was your favourite?
So I think the first thing I'd say is that's so true. It was a life lesson. Okay, the world is unfair. Get used to it, and Warhammer didn't shy away from that. I was always a human. If I'm honest, when I played the fantasy battle game, the war game, it was always either undead or elves. That was my thing. But when it came to doing the role playing game, human all the time. It didn't really. I think, to be honest, a lot of time the ref didn't actually give me much choice. As I said, the one I remember most was just trying to. I'd love to have been a wizard, never got the chance. Definitely is my option of choice. Just like the idea of, it's almost like being fantasy's Batman, because you can do the stuff that nobody else can do, right? So you can, if somebody needs to be able to climb a wall, you've got spells that can help you do it and stuff like that. So, I was less about chucking fireballs, although that was obviously great fun, but more about kind of utility belt wizard, and that's the kind of angle I liked. Didn't get the chance in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, as I said. That's the one memorable character I remember having started off as a boatman and desperately wanted to be a highwayman by the end of it, which is not exactly on the paladin side of the spectrum, right?
Well, if you're very lucky, one day I will run a game for you and I won't make you roll on the table and you can be that wizard's apprentice.
Oh,
I know. Get a
don't
petty
make
magic
promises you
spell.
can't keep, Ian.
That's some pretty big growth for me in there. Your old age willing to be a bit more lenient with your friends. I like it.
What about you, Steve? Any favourite careers or races?
Oh gosh, there were so many. Like, I mean, I always would gravitate towards either sort of like the roguey type bounty hunter type characters, or the going down like the warrior sort of men at arms type thing, because I always kind of like those two. But some of the ones that I wish I'd been play but never got a chance to were all the unique ones that were racial. So like the dwarfs got some really interesting class careers. Like, I mean, engineers, things like that. The ones that you look on the table. I was really looking at the table, like, just look at the table and look at the ones that are only racial specific, and those are probably some of the most interesting career classes in the entire game. And they are. Those would be the ones that I wish that I'd got a chance to play, because they were just interesting. They weren't a road warden. They were like, if you look at the engineering page, it's 2/3 of the page, and it gets all sorts of interesting stuff. It gets like 8 skills.
Yeah, the dwarfs have a real monopoly on the career-specific ones. I mean, I had one guy who always wanted to be a troll slayer, and he eventually got to be one, and then just spent the entire game spoiling for a fight. It was kind of disruptive. But they had things like tunnel fighter, and there was even, bizarrely, runner, which I think was the only, or one of the only career classes in the game that had a advance for movement. And it was these dwarfs that would run around under tunnels and deliver messages to other dwarf holds. And I still remember the pictures, this weird dwarf with a running headband on. And it seemed a really peculiar career for dwarfs, because they're not really noted for their speed. But there you go, you've got the Linford Christie of the dwarf world running around under the ground.
That's kind of par for the course with early Games Workshop, is they just did a bunch of bizarre things. Like, they hadn't figured out the lore yet. They did a bunch of weird things and saw what stuck for both their Warhammer games.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, I talked about it earlier in the podcast about the Realm of Chaos expansion, and I'd waited for that expansion for years, and mainly because it said you're going to get rules in here for, in the role-playing game, role-playing Champions of Chaos, which I thought was like the best thing ever. And then when the rules came out, it was all just for fantasy and a little bit for 40k at the time. And there was about a page for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay that basically said, you probably don't want to do this because it'll be really disruptive. And I remember it was one of the first things I did when I got this book was run a really bad Realm of Chaos campaign where they all played Champions of Chaos. The thing is, the players absolutely loved it, because at that time I only had rules for the gods Khorne and Slanesh, and everyone's like, can we all be champions of Khorne? And I ran this, I won't even call it a campaign, a series of skirmishes where they ran about the Chaos Wastes. I had no idea what I was doing, and they were just killing things, and eventually ended up killing each other. And afterwards, it was like, that was the best thing ever, because one guy became a demon. And I was like, is this what people want? And then fast forward a few years, and you saw the sheer amount of money the Games Workshop made by selling Chaos miniatures and Chaos beasts. I thought, yeah, that actually was what people wanted. They wanted death and destruction and people in black armor with spiky bits on it hacking each other into oblivion. Now, Jason, you've mentioned that you always wanted to be a wizard in Warhammer, and I actually think your GM was probably doing you a favour, because again, as I mentioned earlier on the podcast, I had a bit of a rant about how the magic system in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was basically the magic system from Warhammer Fantasy Battle 2nd edition, just tacked on with a few extra bits and bobs, and it really was a bit clunky and didn't really work very well, and made being a wizard very, very difficult. Compared to the more modern games that we have nowadays, looking back on it, what do you guys think of the system and where it fell down and where it could improve?
So obviously we all like the character generation, right? So it kind of took things down a little bit. Well, it was fun, you know. As you said, you spent hours looking at these things, going, "Oh, I wish I could be this, I wish I could be that," and it was a little bit less two-dimensional than just I'm going to pick up a sword and hit people with it. For a combat game, it always struck me as a little bit clunky, the kind of skill resolution and combat section of it. And in fact, I mean, at the moment, we're still running like a Dark Heresy game, and it's still clunky, and it uses pretty much the same mechanics. So they haven't improved. They haven't learned anything about it. You know, you said today about things like D&D 5, where literally you can pick it up, and it's not hard to get into it and start doing stuff. And this is a bit harder. So I guess it's not a. If somebody who starts their role-playing career with Mert, for example, this would be a walk in the park. But for most of us, it was a bit of a shock to the system, I guess. It's not beginner friendly, maybe.
Oh no, definitely not. And we starting career would be a stretch for that, because it was an incredibly difficult game for a bunch of 12-year-olds to even get their heads around. Never mind.
It's a difficult career now. A difficult
yeah, absolutely.
Now, right?
I re-looked that manual yesterday. I still don't get it. I still don't get it. But Warhammer, I mean, ultimately, like a percentile-based game, especially when you're starting with low percentiles, doesn't make. And again, it goes back to why am I playing? And a lot of people want to be heroic, right? It's like you want to be heroic, and when you're starting with like a 30% chance for success, like to hit someone, because that's what you rolled, or even less, it's not particularly fun if all you're doing is miss. Oh, occasionally I get a hit because you don't have a particularly high percent chance of actually consistently doing anything. And maybe I'm not mathing it right for like Dungeons and Dragons, but I feel like in a game like 5th edition these days, or even, and I'm sure they've fixed it to a degree with the new version of Warhammer, that it feels a little bit more like you actually have a chance of being effective from day one and newer games, because they don't want people to get disillusioned by everybody being just a bit rubbish, really. I think that's probably, and again, I'd have to try it again to see if that's actually if my recollection from years ago is still true, but it certainly felt like that to me.
I completely agree with you that it was one of the frustrations that my players used to always say with the combat system was combats would take ages, not because anything particularly dramatic was happening, but because, you know, they're standing in front of this Skaven and they're swinging and they're missing, and then the Skaven swings and misses, and then eventually somebody connects. And the way the system was, once you actually hit someone and did more damage than they did, you then got the advantage, and you get a bonus to hit them next round. And it was a sort of system whereby you would then just keep on hitting them, and you would end up getting bludgeoned into the ground. And it would take a long time to do that. But I would argue that because it's a low fantasy world, and you're meant to be playing somebody who's been doing something, that you're a labourer or something, and you decided, right, I want to go off and find fame and fortune. It was actually fairly realistic in that sense. However, back to your point, I'm not sure how much fun that necessarily is. You know, people want to be the larger-than-life heroic character. However, the one part of the system that I know that everyone did love was the critical hit tables in combat. Clunky as combat was, people got really, really excited whenever they got a critical hit, namely because whoever designed that was so visceral. When you guys played it, was there that same grisly delight with the critical hit table, or did I just happen to game with a bunch of animals?
No, definitely. I was there. You know, if there's any chance that you could chop somebody's arm off and watch the blood fountain around. And there was there's silly things. I'm sure there was one where, you know, if there was so much blood that you would then slip and slide around the area. that kind of that square hex, whatever that area became like dangerous, difficult ground effectively, because there was just so much like viscera on the floor and things like that. So no, you are not the only bloodthirsty one amongst us here, not by a long shot.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think back about that, because I think is like a teenager, wherever you maybe get that. Oh, I get to watch like an 18 rated movie by playing this game, when it's it's that delight of as a teenager getting to have that much more gory, whereas something like D&D is maybe a little bit more sanitized. So there's definitely that element of this is definitely not your kid's role playing game. Certainly, I would imagine if I was to go look at my crystal ball and look at the current versions of the game, there's probably not that level of stuff in it, because it's probably been a bit more sanitized, given that Games Workshop and their licenses are probably a little bit more kid friendly these days.
Yeah, that's a shame, right?
Yeah, it is.
It's weird though when you consider in the 80s, especially in the States, and there was the infamous satanic panic about Dungeons and Dragons, and people thinking it encourages kids to be Satanists and blah 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 blah. And D&D, when D&D second edition came out, they took out the various references to demons and devils. They called them something else, but they took out any implicit references. But you look across the pond to the UK, and you've got Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay there that not only is full on got a section on devils and demons, you can be a demonologist, you can summon these things, you can make pacts with them. There's rules on drawing pentagrams in the floor to summon them. But they also have this incredibly gory combat system where, as Steve put it, it's like watching an 18 movie. There's critical hits where you stave in someone's skull with your axe, or you cut them in two with your broadsword. And meanwhile, poor old D&Ds across the pond in America getting hauled over the coals for all sorts of shenanigans. But I think you're right, Steve, that when Games Workshop went through its shift in the early 90s, that's probably one of the reasons that the role-playing side of the business was pushed off to the side to make way for probably because little plastic models sold a lot better, but also to make it more wholesome and family-friendly.
Yeah, we need that as a hobby, though, right? We need that as a hobby. It's Games Workshop, for all their faults and flaws and stuff. They're one of the most evidential kind of presences on our high street. Kids walk by them, they see it, wow, look at the state of that, and before you know it, they're playing War Machine, or they're playing D&D, or they're you talk about gateway drugs, and fighting fantasy was definitely a gateway drug, but nowadays that gateway drug seems to be Games Workshop, and long may it continue. That's not a
yeah, absolutely. I mean, much as I will rave
about
about various Games Workshop business decisions, I think you're absolutely right. They are one of the main locus that drags people into the hobby. I mean, you think even back in the 80s that when they were publishing under license all those various RPGs from the US and abroad, and they were the ones that got people into it. Did any of you find yourself playing through any of the published scenarios and campaigns, or did you find yourself doing entirely homebrew stuff that your own GM made up?
Ours was all homebrew. It really was. What was the big one? Was the Shadows campaign, wasn't it?
The Enemy Within.
The Enemy Within. That's the fella. Everybody always wanted to do it, but nobody ever got round to doing it. Obviously, you probably did, didn't you?
I'm actually looking at my shelf where I have all the original supplements sitting there.
Of course you do. Of course you do.
I never actually ran it through from beginning to end, though, mainly because the last chapter was so badly done. Again, I ranted about that on the earlier section of the podcast, but it was so awful. You had this wonderful campaign that was very investigative. The players felt, the atmosphere in it's fantastic. They feel that they're embroiled in some bigger conspiracy that they don't understand. And then you get this awful adventure at the end where they spend most of the time standing around listening to powerful NPCs talking, and then they get set off on a wilderness trek, a dungeon crawl, and a boss battle. And you're like, really?
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a good end, right?
No, it wasn't. What about yourself, Steve? Did you ever play through any of the pre-published stuff?
Mostly like things like the Star Adventure, maybe a little bit spawning off of that. Again, I have the same feeling as like I always saw that the Enemy Within was always that gold standard that I always wanted to play through and never got to. And then even the later one, the later one with those colored, there was like a yellow book and a red book. It was sort of one that came a little bit later, I think maybe even in the second edition.
Yeah, the Doomstones campaign. Maybe.
Yeah, that one always looked great too, and I never got to play through any of them. So those are kind of some of my biggest regrets of those. All look like such amazing seminal. Like this is kind of like the experience of the game. And if you've not, you'll never truly have the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay experience unless you play these campaign. I always have that missing out feeling, and they keep re-releasing them. So maybe one day I'll persuade someone to come and play it with me, because I know they're re-releasing the Enemy Within for the latest edition, and hopefully they'll fix some of the issues you mentioned. It sounds like that's pretty infamous, so maybe one day.
Well, let me save you one of your regrets. The Doomstones campaign was terrible. I don't know the exact reason for it, but it seems to be that when they spun off the role-playing division into its own thing, they needed new material. And the Doomstones campaign, I think, was an old AD&D supplement that was never published. So they just kind of Warhammered it and released it in 4 or 5 parts, whatever it was. But it just did not fit in with the Warhammer world. It was an AD&D adventure. And, AD&D in its own right is great. It has its own feel, though. So when you read this stuff, you're like, this isn't Warhammer. This is very high fantasy and very heroic. And it's also a dungeon crawl looking for gems. So you've not missed anything there. Enemy Within, though, was amazing. The first 4 parts of it certainly were like nothing I'd ever read before. And it was strange. I mean, that bunch of players I had that I told you loved the roaming around the Chaos Wastes, hacking each other up into sushi, they were actually initially quite thrown by it because a lot of it is very investigative. It's almost a bit more like Call of Cthulhu than it is D&D. And it's very well done in that they accidentally get embroiled in a conspiracy. And I won't spoil anything because people will still want to play it, but it's incredibly well done. And this bloodthirsty group very quickly got into it because there's that satisfaction of uncovering clues and being able to lead it on to something else. And there was always a payoff from each one of the clues you discovered. And also there was experience points for doing that as well. So of course people loved getting XP. So it's a really well done campaign that, like you, Steve, I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with the new version. Apparently they're including some hints and tips in it to change it up if people have already played the original one. So if you want to put a little bit of a spin on it, there's bits in there to do that. But I did read that they're producing an entirely new ending for it, which is wonderful. There's also an ending online. Somebody wrote an ending in the early 2000s, I think it was, for the Enemy Within because they weren't happy with the original. And this thing's huge. I've never read through the whole thing, but it seems to be much more in keeping with the spirit of the original than the nonsense that get churned out at the end of the Enemy Within campaign.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And I will say something you made me think about there a little bit is obviously things like D&D, you stereotype that the cliche is it's a dungeon crawl, like that's what you do in Dungeons and Dragons. And Call of Cthulhu, maybe the other extreme where combat is not really the thing. It's like the last resort, and it usually ends badly. Kind of like I'd say Warhammer maybe bridges the gap to a degree. Obviously, you can have one extreme or the other in either one of those games, but you could absolutely fit in either a more sort of intriguey campaign, and it would fit right into the background and the history, or you could have, well, I just want to go beat up on things like I would in the tabletop game, right? You could fit either one of those fits directly into it, and I think that's also probably one of the strengths of the settings, to be honest. And it's all what your players want, really.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's one thing that there's the introductory scenario that comes with first edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It kind of showcases both of those things because at its heart, it probably is a dungeon crawl. You go into this, you're tracing these underworld people and you end up going into some gang's hideout and there's a bit of fighting goes on there. But there's that element of following clues and trying to find out, why they've stolen this thing in the first place that you're after. And when there's a confrontation at the end that kind of leaves you thinking, oh, hang on, there's something big going on here. And in the notes for the GM, it suggests you can use this as a jumping off point for something bigger. So I think it is a bridge between the two styles of play. I know people have often likened it a bit more to Call of Cthulhu because they've got things like the insanity rules. In D&D, you're never going to run away screaming from whatever you encounter. You're going to bravely draw your sword and fly in there and take it out. Whereas in Call of Cthulhu, you're just going to absolutely lose your mind and wet yourself and fall over. Whereas in Warhammer, there's an acknowledgement that if you see a lot of these sanity blasting horrors of chaos, it's going to have an adverse effect in your mind. And indeed, in the Realms of Chaos supplement, there's those added rules that when you come into contact with chaos stuff, there's a chance you're going to end up getting mutated and have horrible things happen to you. But to your point about the bridging the styles of play, I mentioned earlier, obviously, I had a very bloodthirsty group that were very into the hack and slay aspect. I had another group that I ran Enemy Within for once, and they really get into the whole investigative aspect. And I think they resigned themselves quite early on to the fact that they were the lowest of the low within society. I mean, you had one person was a shepherd, there was a grave robber, there was a wizard's apprentice, Jason, you'll be pleased to hear. and I think a mercenary. And they get short shrift by the nobility at all points. And there's an event that happens in the third part of the Enemy Within where the player characters get hold of a boat, and they find this boat, and the inhabitants have been killed off by bad guys, and they slay the bad guys, and it's quite obvious that if you want, you can take this boat. The players were so excited by this. It's such a mundane thing. It's a boat that you can sail up and down the river and you can trade stuff in. But for them, it was almost like in D&D when you find the magical treasure. Their magical treasure was they found a boat. And they were like, wow, we've really made something of ourselves. We can sell stuff on the river now. We can become merchants. This is wonderful. And you're like, guys, you've just found a boat. And they had all these grand plans for what they wanted to do. So, of course, they were very annoyed when I ended up sinking the boat at the end of the campaign, when I got sick of their refusal to follow my clues and just wanted to spend the whole life being river gypsies.
My boatman never got a boat.
Oh, that is the saddest thing I've heard today.
I know, exactly. I mean, can you imagine? I'd have been over the moon if my ref had given me a boat.
Yeah, you'd be able to use your boating skill. Or
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That was another thing with the skill system. There were some fairly pointless skills in there. I mean, as an adult looking back on it, I think the brewing skill is a pretty good skill to have. As a 12-year-old, you feel kind of shortchanged when you get the brewing skill, and you're like, so, especially when you read the description, and it's like, basically, you know how to sit in a cellar for months and then brewing beer. You're like, who's going to be doing that? Why have I got this skill and he's got very strong and strike mighty blow?
Whereas now, of course, we're all sitting there going, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to sit in a basement and brew beer. Yeah, I mean, but what's the target age of the game? I mean, you're just talking about things like the massive criticals and the bloodthirsty nature and the sanity blasting aspects. This is old school. It's not. Was it made for 12-year-olds?
It was, and that was the thing. I remember having a big discussion with my mum because I got this for my Christmas in, I think, 1986, and on the back of the book there's a box with this sort of data about the game, and it says ages 16 up, and she was kind of horrified by this, and was like, oh, what's that book got in it? And I'm like, yeah, Mum, it's like Tolkien, there's monsters and dragons and things.
And how to summon a demon.
Very rapidly lost interest in that. Yeah, I didn't show the demon summoning chapters. Both of you mentioned earlier that you were Warhammer Fantasy Battle players, and I think we talked about the fact that Warhammer kind of changed its image early 90s, and it went from the grim and perilous world of adventure to slightly more high fantasy. I mentioned earlier on the podcast that one of the biggest examples of that was in the Empire. And if you look at 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle, the Emperor is this dude who flies around in a griffin. He wields the eponymous Warhammer. He's wearing magic armor, and he's just an all-round badass. Whereas in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st edition, he is this sickly inbred cripple who happens to sit on the throne because all the other electors think it's much easier having someone there they can all bully. How did you find the change in tone, and which one did you prefer? Do you prefer the sort of the grim world of perilous adventure, or the spiky world of improbable mohawks?
Oh, that depends what mood you're in, doesn't it? I suppose. I think I preferred the grimmer stuff. I think I kind of like the fact that it's the differentiator for me. If you don't have that, then it's just, you could argue it's another flavor of D&D, despite how well it may cross over into a slight political game or investigative game. People riding griffins and unicorns and wielding magic warhammers, and it's. What set Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay apart was the shift, the more grim dark kind of aspect to it, and I liked that. But recovering goth, so what can I say?
I thought about this topic quite a lot actually recently. It's tough because I can tell, like I was saying earlier, it's a function of where they were at with evolving like the game's background, because ultimately they were building on top of a game that had a bunch of miniatures and not a lot of lore. Right, they were selling a bunch of miniatures. That's always been the focus for them, right? Is the miniatures, right? And they built the lore. I've read a bunch about Games Workshop because I'm a bit of a Games Workshop nerd these days. I always have been, but they're always building the lore around what the miniatures look like. So Karl Franz probably evolved into what Karl Franz is because they wanted a general on this massive griffin with a hammer, right? So that it was a function of that. And for better or for worse, if you're an old school RPer, I can understand that. I totally can, and I would probably agree to a degree. I mean, honestly, like mostly because I'm a big fan of like where they went with the lore and how they filled it out and made it into this more fully realized world. I guess I would tend towards that, but that's more of a bias than anything else, just because I like where they went with it. It's hard to go back. Maybe when I was that age and I had no other frame of reference, I probably would have said, yeah, absolutely. Why would you change it to anything else? But now where they went with it is where they went with it, and it's hard to go back and say one way or another whether it was better or worse. I think it's better, but again, mostly because they evolved the game into something I thought turned into a fully realized fantasy world that had all these interesting elements and aspects. And even playing Total War Warhammer recently, which has been my recent addiction, getting back into the world that was, as they call it now. There's so much lore in there that I missed when I was mostly focused on things like 40k, that I was like, wow, they've gone so far down the road on all these things that were just figments of someone's imagination back in the first edition.
I don't know about, but to back that up, I guess, and is how many of us haven't found a miniature in a hobby store and gone, that's my next character.
Mm-hmm.
That's who I want to be. Whether it's a double bearded axe wielding minotaur or whether it's some guy in a griffin with a warhammer, doesn't matter. The fact is, you looked at that, it was inspiration for you, I guess.
And did you ever find that when you played with miniatures that you felt compelled to actually make your character be the miniature that you had? There was a guy that I used to play with, and the miniature that he had to represent, I can't even remember what his character was. It had this particular weird-looking weapon, and it was something that looked vaguely Eastern. I don't even know what range of miniatures it came from. But he was insistent that his character had to have this weapon in the game. I ended up just giving it the same rules as a sword and gave it some exotic sounding name. But you had people that somehow put these character traits on the miniature that they had and felt compelled to, even if the character changed, in the game and developed more attributes and more skills, to somehow bring it back to this tiny 25mm lead representation on the table.
Definitely. Yeah, I've seen it happen several times, and it is nice when the miniature does represent what you've got. I guess I'd use it as inspiration more, but if you can satisfy that need just by changing the name of the item and giving it the same stats as a sword, then that's color, it's kind of background. I remember playing Eberron games and deliberately picking weird weaponry that came out of their source book. It wasn't particularly any good. It just called something different, right? It was a scimitar, but it was called something different. And that all adds to the color of the character, I guess. I mean, when it becomes an obsession, I think I'd have a problem with it. My fighter, despite the fact that I've now got this huge extra magic weapon, but it's not the one I want to use, or comes across some armor and I'm not going to wear that. I only wear chain. It's like, yeah,
it's an interesting world to be in, to be sure, but miniatures, especially nowadays. I could talk about 3D printing miniatures and about going the other way, is that you're now making your miniatures look like what you want them to look like, rather than you kind of were, you got what you got back in the day. It was like there was very little choice. You got an elf with a bow. That was it. Well, never mind if you switched to crossbow later, you had an elf with a bow, because it's probably not an elf with a crossbow, right? Later on. So that was always just to close the gap for me. I was always kind of like, well, yeah, it's a representation, but I don't want to limit my character to like not being able to change later on because of what the miniature has, because that's all that I have, and I'm a poor kid who doesn't have the time to go search for a bunch of miniatures that might look like my new geared character. So yeah.
I had one guy who did go to the opposite end of the spectrum, because we went through a phase, and again, we're about 12 years old, where one of the guys said, hey, it'd be really cool if we played with miniatures, because we started off not playing with them. We played with them when we did Warhammer, but not when we did the roleplay game. And he'd been reading something about dungeon floor plans and can we use miniatures. So I kind of made the ruling, well, you can play with miniatures, but you need to bring your own ones along. I'm not getting a load of miniatures for you guys. And Games Workshop produced a series for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It was a little blister packs, and I think you got 5 people inside it. And there was a group of them went and bought a pack of these miniatures, and they kind of divvied them up between them. 4 of the players found characters that roughly represented what they were playing. And the 5th player, who really didn't care about miniatures, his character in the game was a thief, and he was like a burglar or something like that. The miniature he had to represent it, which was the one left over in the pack, and he's like, I'm using this. I can't be bothered going to buy one of my own. I'm stuck with this one. It was some sort of foppish-looking Elizabethan merchant, and he's got the big floppy hat, and he's holding a scroll or something. And some of the other players, especially the guy who was very into, you play with your representation on the table. He's like, well, that's nothing like your character. And he's like, so it's just a piece that represents where I am on the table. And I still remember he refused to paint it as well. And there was this ridiculous-looking guy with a floppy hat and a scroll. Yeah, he was this cat burglar that could break into buildings. So some people did go out the other end of the spectrum. Question for both of you. We've talked about Warhammer 4th edition having come out. Have either of you seen or played? There was a spin-off game actually. It was more a tribute game called Zweihander that was released a few years ago.
No, never even heard of it, mate. I'm interested though. What's it about?
Well, I'll ask Steve first. Steve, have you seen it?
I tend to follow a lot of RPG sites and tabletop streams on Twitch and things like that. And so I've heard of it and I've watched stuff about it. And it's interesting to me because, I mean, I'll let you dive into more details, but really it's what I believe the branded gimmicky term is retro clone is what they're calling it of first and second edition Warhammer. So just hearing that perked my attention up, and why I think Ian's probably bringing it up, because it's like from a nostalgia perspective of like pulling things into the 21st century of what we experienced as kids. This might be something along those lines.
It is. So I've actually got a copy here. It's entitled Grim and Perilous RPG. It's an absolute monster of a book. Let me have a look at it here. It weighs in.
Wow.
If you thought the original Warhammer rulebook was big, this one here weighs
That's
in.
a monster.
Just shy of 700 pages. I may have to actually cut this out, but I'm going to drop it on the table, and it makes quite a noise. It's an absolutely gorgeous book. It's huge. It's very well done, and I've not run it. I've kind of read through it, and it seems to try and capture the tone of the original, I'd say more first ed than second ed Warhammer, in terms of it's this grim and gritty generic fantasy world where they avoid trying to use copyrighted Games Workshop terms. Like they're a Skaven in the book, but they're called something else. But it's very interesting. I think, as Steve said, a retro clone is probably the best way to describe it. But I think they produced this before 4th ed was announced. I don't know the exact timing of it, because you had a 3rd edition of Warhammer that Fantasy Flight Games produced that was a bit more like a board game than a role-playing game. And from what I heard, it wasn't particularly true to the tone of 1st ed. So we've got this Zweihander clone. I may be interested to run it someday, but it certainly takes up a lot of space on the bookshelf. And it's entitled A Grim and Perilous RPG, which is always nice.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it fits with the kind of theme, as you say, Grim and Perilous RPG.
Yeah,
and the picture's pretty. It's kind of semi-Germanic. Obviously, Zweihander is German, obviously, but the whole Empire stuff was quite Germanic back in the Warhammer Fantasy days. So
and this has that same theme to it as well. I mean, I'm just looking through it here, and I'm impressed by the sheer volume of artwork in this book. Like every page has got multiple illustrations. And the thing I love about it is they're all black and white, which is very much like the original. There's always a temptation these days to make everything full color, and I kind of respect the fact that they've got these black and white, what looks like pencil drawings on each page, and it also looks like it's the same artist that's done every drawing, which gives it a nice, consistent feel. But certainly, the theme of the images and the theme of the game seems to be this vaguely Germanic Renaissance feel rather than the medieval or Tolkien high fantasy feel. I've yet to run it or see what the system's like. I mean, from what I've read, the system seems a lot tighter and more balanced than the original Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. But you could argue that its lack of balance was part of its charm. Have either of you ever played or experienced anything to do with the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay?
My Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay days are long ago. First edition only me, I'm afraid.
So old school, Jason.
Yeah, oh yeah.
It's on my wish list to play right now. But you could say the same thing about Zweihander. Both are interesting new takes that kind of refresh me wanting to play the game. I would be probably more interested in Warhammer 4th edition because just the lore is like, I think Zweihander is great in that they're trying to recapture it, but like I kind of went into it wanting Warhammer, and especially now with what I know of Warhammer, I'd rather play the 4th edition because I don't have to worry about tiptoeing around the copyrighted stuff. You're going to get all the things that you want out of Warhammer in terms of the lore that they had with the fantasy battle all the way up to the time they wrapped it up. So I actually picked up the book. I've been meaning to pick it up, and I picked it up and took a look through it, and it's definitely much more streamlined. You can definitely tell it's got its roots in 1st and 2nd edition, but it's clearly, a 2020 style RPG. And Cubicle 7, the guys who are making it now, seem like they've got a solid track record and of doing good licensed games. From everything I've read, they're not putting out bad stuff. So it's definitely an interest to me to give that a shot sometime. It's getting time in groups.
You can answer a question for me then, Steve, because something that I saw, but Jason will laugh at this because he knows what my predilections are like, but I was looking at some of the artwork, and something that really put me off was every single piece of artwork that I saw for this game featured somebody wielding 2 pistols, including one of somebody walking through rain holding 2 pistols upright. I'm thinking, you've got black powder weapons there, why are you holding them in the rain? Is there a fecundity of people wielding 2 pistols at once?
It's all John Woo's fault, right?
It is John Woo. I blame him for a lot of the world's evils.
I mean, you can't go wrong with 2 pistols. I mean, everything's cooler with 2 pistols, right?
I've lost so much respect for you.
Except for reloading. It's awfully difficult with 2 pistols, right?
Well, why do you have to put reality? It's a role-playing game. Forever.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I hated about 2nd edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. For some reason, we had to include like firearms that were repeater weapons. One of the things I loved about 1st Ed was everyone wanted firearms, and then when they finally got one, they were like, these things are terrible, I might as well use a bow. They make a huge noise, they're very unreliable, they'll blow up in your face, they don't do any more damage than the bow, and yet you then get 2nd Ed where suddenly you've got miniguns, and that's always put me off it.
I can't really complain. I did want to be a highwayman, right?
Yeah, that's different. That's for the kind of, you fire it once in the air and say stand and deliver.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
You basically just want to be adamant.
Yep, yeah, that is pretty much how it worked out.
Well, listen, chaps, on that note, we'll leave things for this episode. Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we'll have you on again in future episodes.
Thanks very much. Cheers, Ian.
Yeah.
Cheers, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was great. I'd love to come on again sometime.
Thank goodness that's done.
And that was part 3 of episode 1, a roundtable about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. We hope you enjoyed our ramblings. I'd like to thank Steve and Jason for taking the time out to appear in the show. We're a semi-regular podcast about old school role-playing games. If you enjoyed this episode, please get in touch with us on Twitter at SavePodcast or email us at roll.2.save.pod@gmail.com. Yeah, that's a lot of dots. You can also find us on Facebook by searching for Roll to Save. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to leave us a review on your podcast directory of choice. Apparently, those 5-star reviews will do wonders for our visibility. Thanks again for listening.